Hi everyone, my name is Enrique Cardona and welcome to a new episode of my podcast. Today's episode I'm talking about is a subject matter that many people have already know about, that is the Montreal Screw Job. So many people, including myself, know this story for many years that I didn't need a script to say what I had to say. So let's not just cut to the chase and let's talk about what transpired in the Montreal Screw Job. So, what's the Montreal Screwjob about? Well, basically, at Survivor Series 1997, Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels face each other for the WWF Championship. And in the last moment, we see that Shawn Michaels puts Bret Hart in a sharpshooter maneuver, and the referee calls for the belt. And basically, Bret Hart never tapped out. And it became like the Montreal Screwjob because it was a submission that never happened and they screw a wrestler for many reasons. However, Dark Side of the Ring, which is the episode that I'm reviewing right now, also talks about the Montreal Screwjob. It was the second episode of their show in season 1. So what's it about? What's the Montreal Screwjob about and why there were many people mad about it? So let's take a look a couple of way back. Everything began with the man itself, Bret Hart, who was a wrestler for many years, and he was the son of Stu Hart, who created his own wrestling company, Stampede Wrestling. But it was bought out by Vince McMahon and the WWF. So, Bret Hart goes to WWF and becomes a wrestler there. And not only a tag team wrestler with his then brother-in-law, Jim Neidhart, but he became one of the best wrestlers in the world. And he became the WWF champion like in time because in the 90s he was becoming the new face of the WWF. So with that being said, it was also a time in 1990s where the wrestling companies were fighting for supremacy, also known as the Monday Night Wars. Now, the Monday Night Wars is something that many people had talked about for many years, so I'm gonna be brief. It was basically WWF versus WCW. And because of that, many wrestlers and many wrestling companies were fighting each other. And many wrestling companies were buying other wrestlers from other companies for money and supremacy. And such is the case as WCW, who was buying everybody from the WWF to make their roster much bigger and bigger and better. And because of that, they wanted Bret Hart there. And because of that, Bret Hart didn't want to go to WCW because he was more loyal to the WWF than he was with WCW. But 1996, which was the year which they signed to a 3-year contract with Bret Hart, wasn't the best year, and 1997 was even worse. Because in the 90s, it was all about the anti-heroes, such as Stone Cold, the NWO, Shawn Michaels, and that's where the story begins because Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels were having a rivalry that many people will say is volatile. And it was basically about a man who was good and a man who was very rebel, and they were fighting each other for the supremacy of the company of WWF. Shawn Michaels in the 1990s was very much not himself. He was doing drugs, doing alcohol. He was basically full of ego, full of itself. When he became champion at the worst time, which was 1996, it was bad for him. And because of that, he didn't like Bret Hart, and Bret Hart didn't like him. And that created a rivalry that was going on screen and off screen. Many people have recalled Bruce Pritchard in particular in this interview that Bret Hart was fighting Shawn Michaels backstage, and so much so that Bret Hart said that he managed to get a chunk of the hair of Shawn Michaels, and Shawn complained that it was an unsafe environment. In 1997, it was the year where everybody analyzed in the WWF that the contract with Bret Hart was not going. They didn't like the direction they were going. Bret Hart was turning heel, or at least for the Americans, because he became a Canadian hero. And because of that, many people hate him for that, at least the fans in 1997. So WWF and Vince McMahon in particular wanted to buy out Bret Hart's contract. There were a few problems with that, because Bret Hart was the champion in 1997. He didn't like Shawn, but more importantly, at Survivor Series 1997 took place in Montreal, Canada. And because of that, Vince McMahon had a trouble, because Bret Hart didn't want to drop the title on his hometown. So many people have said that he cooked up the Montreal Screw Job as a way to get rid of the title, because I'm not speculating, I'm not saying this is a fact, but recall the moment when Medusa left the WWF to go to WCW? The first thing she did on TV was taking the women's title from the WWF and throw it to the garbage under the orders of Eric Bischoff to make it more edgy. I can see why Vince did what he did, because he didn't want to repeat the same mistakes he did with Medusa. Let her live to the WCW and see his own wrestler throwing the championship to the garbage. So a lot of people have speculated on how the Montreal Screwjob came to be. So there are two perspectives, the ones with Jim Cornette and Vince Russo. Now Jim Cornette will become the person to be reviewed the most, or talk about the most, in Dark Side of the Ring, because he will talk about in many episodes about his perspective into many things in every episode, at least the majority of the Dark Side of the Ring episodes. Another perspective that is put into question is Vince Russo. Vince Russo was the head writer of the WWF at that time, so he wanted to talk about the Montreal Screwjob and say what it came to be. Now, the two perspectives, let's begin with Jim. Now, Jim has said over the years that the Montreal Screwjob was an idea he came to be, because he actually read in a magazine about two wrestlers who did a Montreal Screwjob like way years back, or a screwjob like that like in the 80s or 70s. He basically said that one of the wrestlers bit other one in the shoulder, and to make it look like the wrestler bit the other wrestler, to get the pinfall victory. Others, like Vince Russo says that he came up with the Montreal Screwjob out of desperation. And many said that it was all an idea from Triple H, from Shawn Michaels, from Vince himself, from others. But those are the two perspectives that are talked about in this episode. And then we have to talk about the hours before the Montreal Screwjob. You see, Bret Hart talked about with the referee Earl Hebner about the match itself. He said that please don't let me screw me, don't let them screw me, don't let them take away my championship. And Earl was just in the worst possible spot that he could ever be put on. Another documentary that it was filmed, Wrestling with Shadows, was telling Bret Hart to put a microphone like the one I have right now in order to talk with Vince about the finish of the match. And we heard that Vince said it was going to be a disqualification, and it was going to be simple as that. He was going to be on the next day saying that it was an injury that prevented him to defend the title. He will relinquish it, because Bret Hart said that he wanted to relinquish the title to the next night on Raw. But Vince wasn't convinced, but they said yes in the end. And hours before that, and in the last minutes, Jerry Briscoe told Earl Hebner to please ring the bell, even though Bret Hart was not going to submit. Otherwise, Earl Hebner will be fired on the spot. So the match went on this way. Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels wrestled. Despite their differences, they wanted to wrestle that night. But at the last moment, when Shawn Michaels was putting the sharpshooter on Bret Hart, and Bret said this in this interview, he said that he recalled Vince telling to the ring announcer to ring the bell, telling to Earl Hebner to ring the bell, to stop the match, to give the victory to Shawn Michaels. Bret was trying to reach for the leg of Shawn Michaels, but it was too late. The Montreal Screw Job happened, and everybody was in shock. I mean, everybody was shook. Jim Cornette says that he just ran to his car in order to prevent to be hit. Many wrestlers were upset that day. Bret Hart said that The Undertaker kicked a bucket of garbage. After the match, Bret Hart goes to their locker room all pissed. He takes a shower. He threats Vince to leave the locker room. He says that if he's still in the locker room, that he was going to punch him. And Bret Hart finished the shower. He started to dress. Vince was still there. He says that it was a decision he wanted to make. It was a decision he had to make for his own company and his family. And Bret Hart grabbed Vince's shoulder and said 14 years in his head and punched him in an uppercut Mike Tyson kind of punch. And Vince was left with a bruised eye. So Bret was pissed. The next day it was hell in the offices. People were asking Vince why he did what he did, and he told all the wrestlers that if they don't like what he did, that they could gladly leave the company. Bret Hart left the company, and so does Jim Neidhart and the British Bulldog. Owen Hart will stay, and one day I'll probably will talk about Owen Hart, but for now let's keep the focus on Bret Hart. But basically, yeah, after the Montreal Screw Job, Bret Hart wasn't the same after that. Many people, including Eric Bischoff, recalls that Bret wasn't the same after the Montreal Screw Job. When he was brought to WCW, he was just there. He wasn't doing anything special. If you want an idea of what Bret did in WCW, I suggest you go to Wrestling with Regret with Brian Sane and see the episode he did on Bret Hart on WCW and see what the consequences brought to Bret being there. But yeah, I'll say this, Bret Hart was so unhappy with the Montreal Screw Job that he was just not the same after that, and WCW didn't help matters because they were giving him plans that he didn't like. They were not treating him like a star because of the politics there. And while he was going bad there, WWF took the controversy and ran with it, with Vince McMahon becoming the evil, conniving businessman and the head of the WWF, and basically became the best heel characters of all time and the WWF prospects. So yeah, the Montreal Screw Job was a curse for Bret Hart, but a blessing for WWF. And that's something that many people struggle about, because many people say it should not ever happen, others said it had to happen. But many people, including myself, don't know what to think about this. So in the end, it's just my opinions. Now, on the opinion matters subject, let's talk about Bret Hart himself and see what do I think about Montreal Screw Job. So, what are my final thoughts in this episode of Dark Side of the Ring, the Montreal Screw Job? Well, I can say three things. Number one, the Montreal Screw Job is something that is pretty much carved into history. Everybody will remember in different ways, and everybody will have their own version of the story. In my opinion, it's a story that, even though I didn't like how it happened and how it played out at the end, it's a story that reminds us the side of the wrestling storytelling as well as the real life people. is always a thin line, and you need to know exactly who your friends are and your enemies are. The Montreal Screw Job, if anything, it taught me that this business will have its friends and enemies, and you need to be careful who is your friend and who is your enemy. And many people will always become alphas, and they'll always fight for the number one spot. It's just the way it is, and you need to be careful with the people you deal with, especially with the people above you who make you the champion. And that's something to remember in the wrestling business. Sometimes you need to be careful who you're making business with. Another thing, which is the second part of this perspective, is Vince Russo and Jim Cornette. Now, I'm not going to say anything. I'd rather wait until I see the Brawl for All and give my thoughts then, but I will say this. Both Jim Cornette and Vince Russo are acting immaturely, and they are already 50 years old between those two. They have to apologize. And I'm not saying, they have to become friends, but come on. It's been years and they have to apologize for that moment, because Jim Cornette in this episode, he just straight up hates Vince Russo. And this is part of the reason in this documentary it's important to review, because this is something that both of those men always fight against, because the story of the wrestling business is always about the sizzle and the steak, and they both have different perspectives. But I'll say this, just for the love of God, Jim, Vince, just apologize already. Grow up. And now let's get to Bret Hart itself. Now, Bret Hart is a man that, like I said before in my previous video, is a man I respect and I believe that is the best wrestler in the world. This is why I consider him one of my favorite wrestlers. I saw his documentary in A&E, and whether people like that documentary or not, it makes me appreciate more and more what Bret Hart went through, because the Montreal Screw Job, believe it or not, it had a negative effect on him, and it's been affecting him ever since then. And all I can say to him is that I'm sorry for everything. He had to go through so much adversity, so much politician, wrestling business things that I don't even know how to comprehend them. And above else, he suffered a lot of loss. His father, his brother, his nephews, his cousins. This man had to endure a lot of pain and a lot of adversity to be here today. And the man, whether you like him or not, you have to respect his body of work. I believe Bret Hart, in my opinion, deserves a lot of credit and a lot of love that he doesn't get these days, or he didn't get back then. Because he's a man who's good in his heart. Whether you believe he's a good person or not, whether you believe he was a good character, it doesn't matter. To me, I will always respect and admire Bret Hart for his body of work, but more importantly, for the kind of human being he is. And for me, above anything else, above anything that many people have said in the past, whether people always believe to be a stealth character, I don't care. I care about the man who is behind the character. And Bret Hart, to me, is one of the best characters and the best wrestlers in the world. And nobody will change my mind on that. I hope one day Bret Hart sees this video, and whether you believe or whether you think this video is not going to be as fire because I haven't said anything new, I make that clear in the beginning. I know that everything that I said in the beginning, that is not going to be news for everyone. But it's important to remember the point of view that many people have. And mine is that whether the Montreal Screw Job was a blessing for WWE, it was a curse for the man. And all I want for him, and all I ever wanted for this man, is to be okay, to have a good life. He has children and grandchildren now. And all I can say to Bret Hart is that I respect you, I admire you, and I'm sorry for what happened to you. And that's all I can say to you. And that's all I can say for the legacy of the man. He is a man that will definitely go in the history books as one of the best wrestlers of all time. And I will remember him for that. And I will always be thankful for introduce us to what wrestling is. As far as the episode is concerned, like I said before, it's still in the beginning stages. It's not as dark as the first 2 episodes, but believe me when I say that the more we deal into this show, the more darker it gets. So I will say I will take a break from this one, and next week we'll review the Black Widow movie. Don't worry, I'll give my thoughts onto that movie. But for now, I've been Enrique. Give a like to this video, put a notification video, and subscribe to this channel. I'll see you next time.